Welcome to the second part of our 5 DVD series on discovering yourself. And tonight's lecture is called, as you just heard, Forgiving the Unforgivable. Behind me is the famous Tower Bridge, one of the most well-known sites in London. In fact, people often get it mixed up with London Bridge, but no, it's Tower Bridge. And of course, the reason it's called Tower Bridge is because of something just over here. Walk with me. Because over here is the famous Tower of London. This is where Henry VIII and countless English monarchs used to put people in the tower, which was of course a precursor for their execution, their beheading, if in any way they insulted or offended the majesty of the king, or even the queen. Nothing was too small to offend the king. They found it very easy to put you there and extraordinarily difficult to forgive you for what you've done wrong. If you've done something that offended the king, off with your head. It was extremely easy to offend an English monarch, and they found almost every offence unforgivable. About 2 years ago, I was standing in a line at Manchester Airport, and my wife and I, together with another couple we were very friendly with, were going to Switzerland to have a weekend away, which I have to tell you I richly deserved. And we went through, now I don't know if you know Manchester Airport at all, but there are lots and lots of security scanners, and it was my turn. And most of the airport is devoted to people going on package holidays to exciting places like Spain. Anyway, so it was my turn, and I put my bag through the scanner, and after it came out, the fellow said to me, "Do you mind if I look inside your bag, sir?" I said, "No, not at all." And so he took my bag aside, unzipped the bag, and after he unzipped the bag, he put his hand in and he took out 2 packets of sandwiches which my wife had made, covered in aluminium foil. And I distinctly remember thinking, what a twit. He can't tell the difference between Semtex and tuna sandwiches. I mean, what sort of guy is this? And then he put his hand in again. And when he brought it out, he produced a very large knife. I am a qualified scuba diver. And I'd been scuba diving recently. And have you ever seen a scuba diver's knife? It's about that size. It's got a sort of like horrible pointy point. It's got serrated edges for cutting yourself out of trouble, and it's big. And in front of the entire airport, he holds this up. I did not feel good. And so basically he said, "I'm sorry, sir, we have to call the police. Would you sit over there?" So there were 14 lanes of people coming through, 1 chair in the opposite wall. I had to sit in the chair. Have you ever felt guilty? Even when you're innocent? I have to tell you, when you're sitting there in this chair, and I'm trying to look as un-terrorist-like as I possibly could. I don't know how actually you do that. Smiling, friendly. So I stood there, and eventually after 20 minutes, along came 2 policemen with the Koch and Heckler submachine guns. Vroom, vroom. The body armor, the whole thing. "Well, oh," he says, "watch this." And he holds up the knife. So I tried to explain to him I was a scuba diver. "Where were you diving last?" Telling question. "Lake Windermere," I said. "Oh, I come from Lake Windermere." And we started to chat. And he liked me. And he liked the fact I was diving in Lake Windermere, his hometown. And so I got onto the plane. My wife was American. She was trying to tell them why this was totally inappropriate. And my husband's a rabbi. Rabbis don't do terrorism. But anyway, it had a nice, happy ending. Another story which you should perhaps be aware of or be interested in. A number of years ago I was in Cincinnati, and I was talking over a Shabbaton, and there was a fellow there who I liked. He was a medical doctor, and I detected the slightest hint of an accent, mostly an American accent, but there was something there that wasn't quite American. I said, "Where were you born?" This fellow was, I was saying, in his 70s. He said he was born in Antwerp. I said, "Antwerp? Oh, right, I lecture in Antwerp quite a lot." And we started to chat. And I put his age together with where he came from, and I said, forgive me, how did you survive the war? He told me an incredibly interesting story. There was 2 siblings. His mother looked extraordinarily not Jewish. Straw blonde hair, not a Semitic feature about her, and they were hidden by friends. But the mother, because she spoke perfect and flawless German, often travelled with her children quite freely in Antwerp with forged papers, and nobody would bat an eyelid that in reality this was a Jewish woman. And one day she was sitting in a train with her little boy, this little boy, who would one day grow up to be a doctor in Cincinnati, and sitting opposite was a captain in the SS. And he looked at this little boy and he said, what's he called? His eyes, delighted at this beautiful Aryan visage he was seeing. And she didn't bat an eyelid. She said, he's called Arya. Said the captain in the SS, what sort of name is Arya? And without hesitation she said, it's short for Aryan. Ah, Aryan. But not every story has a happy ending. Not everybody gets off with the police when they find large knives in their hand luggage when they get to the airport. Not every story has a happy ending. And you probably know that Judaism splits our interactions into 2 categories. There's the interaction we have with God. It's called in Hebrew, Ben Odom Lamokim. Then there are interactions which we have with other human beings. That's called Ben Odom L'Chaveri. So let me ask, which I'm sure is a rhetorical question because I've asked it literally hundreds of times before to large audiences and small. What do you think is more difficult? Dealing with God or dealing with other people? I pause. Yes, yes. Anybody want to contribute to this? Who is most difficult to deal with, God or people? People, yeah. It's funny, wherever I've asked this question, there is always the exact same answer. Nobody has ever argued with this one. People find people difficult. In fact, somebody wrote a book, I can't remember the name of the author. The title of the book was Learning to Live with Difficult People, Including Yourself. Right? People are difficult. People are hard to deal with. Let me just illustrate this to you by quoting this man here. This is Maimonides, the Rambam, and he is talking about sorting out a relationship with God which has failed, which of course now and again we all find ourselves in that situation. What happens if you've messed up your relationship with God? And suppose you've messed it up very seriously. What are the repercussions of this? So here's a classic bit of Judaism. Here's the Rambam. You should know that even though it is that tshuva always works, there's a particular time when tshuva is extraordinarily appropriate, and that is when it comes to Yom Kippur. Now he says, let me tell you how it works that you can re-establish a relationship with God. And he gives you a whole set of categories. Suppose somebody has got an obligation in Judaism. If you were a man, let's say, you would have to put on tefillin in the morning. That's what's called a mitzvah saseh, a positive commandment. And you fail, for whatever reason, right? You just don't do it. What are the consequences of that? Judaism says, regret it. All you have to do is to sincerely regret that you didn't quite fulfill your obligation, and it gets forgiven. Good. Next stage. Suppose you did something in your relationship with God, which rather than him telling you, I want you to do this, and you failed, he told you, don't do this, and you did. So let's say you ate a piece of bacon. Okay? Then what should you do? There, well, in that case, it's slightly different. It says Maimonides, the Rambam, you have to regret it. Regret it is always the first stage. You've got to say sorry. God, I'm sorry. And then on top of that, you have to throw into the mix something called Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur itself has the effect of, you ever taken something out of the washing machine and the stain's still there? You needed to put in a bit of bleach. The next important factor which is going to remove the stain, that's Yom Kippur. 2, and the stain's gone. Fine. Maimonides says, but what am I talking about? He says, I'm talking about that the thing that you have done wrong doesn't carry with it, it's not so serious, it's not such a bad don't do, that God has demanded of you, that you would be punished, at least in theory, with death for. So that if you, committed adultery, well, Judaism is very negative about that and ultimately carries a death sentence. So suppose you did a don't and it carries the biggie, the death sentence. Then what? Then you need to regret it. Then you need Yom Kippur. Now the stain's not out yet. You need something else. Do you know what the else is? You need suffering in your life. Now that's a whole big talk. Why would you need suffering in your life? But let's just keep it. I'm just reading you the facts at the moment. But he says, then, if you do all that, then you'll be forgiven. As long as that big thing you haven't done didn't drag God's name through the mud. But if you did that, so you've done a no-no, and it's something which would get you actually legally, although there's an opinion in the Talmud that said that the death penalty was never carried out. It's almost impossible to give the death penalty in Judaism, but that'd be for a different talk. But it could carry the death penalty. But if you drag God's name through the dirt at the same time, then you know what? You got to regret it. And you need Yom Kippur. And you need suffering. And then death. Yes, if you die, then that will complete the process and all your sins are wiped away. How are you feeling about that? This is very encouraging. Yes, your religion says that all you need to do is to suffer and die, and then you can have a good relationship with God. Are you feeling encouraged? Oh, I don't see anybody skipping around the room. However, you should know there's somebody called Rabbi YY Rubinstein. Rabbi YY Rubinstein started off as a great critic of Maimonides, eventually regretted that very much, and he wrote a classic work on re-establishing a relationship with God called Shari Tshuva. And he challenges the Rambam on this point. He says, no, you don't need all of that. You don't need all of that. You don't need to suffer in that way. You certainly don't need to die. If you did something so bad that dragged God's name through the dirt, and therefore it's covered in filth, what's called a chilul Hashem, all you need to do in order to redress it, to re-establish your relationship with God, is make a kiddush Hashem, is to polish God's name. So no matter what you've done, no matter how bad it is, you can get forgiven. Says there's a classic work. The classic work is called Mesilas Yesharim by somebody called Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And he says even if a person committed adultery, or even if a person committed murder, now it doesn't get much worse than that. After all, if you committed murder, you've taken away a life that should have been there. If you committed adultery, there's a possibility you brought a life into the world which shouldn't be there. And yet, if a person regrets that, God forgives it. Now, how does that work? How could you re-establish a relationship with God on that basis? So this is what he explains. Do you know that the Maimonides, the famous Rambam, says here, how do you know if you've re-established your relationship with God? And he says famously, if you find yourself in the same situation as you were in before, and you slipped up and gave in, but this time you don't, then you know that you have become a Baal Teshuvah. You've re-established, re-linked yourself to God. Now, can I just point out that Maimonides is not saying you should put yourself into the circumstances to see whether or not you would do the same thing again. But if you did find yourself in the circumstances, let's take the example which he cites. Somebody creates or engages in something which is a sexual crime, immoral. Let's say it's adultery. He is a businessman, he's alone with the secretary and she's very attractive and all that sort of stuff, and I guess you could complete the story. And after that he regrets it. And then a month later he finds himself in the exact same circumstances. And the Rambam emphasizes this. His desire to commit the crime is identical and as strong as it was before. The availability and opportunity is identical and precisely the same as it was before. And yet this time he doesn't do it. But if everything is precisely the same, if everything is identical, then why didn't he do it? If everything's identical. A month ago he did it. Everything is identical now and he doesn't do it. But identical? then he should do it. So what's changed? Answer, he's changed. He or she has changed. That means to say that the person who killed that person lying there or brought that life into the world no longer exists. They may look like him, maybe identical to him, but he no longer exists. He's a different person. So even adultery or even murder, God can forgive that. So therefore, to endorse what you were saying or what your answer, or endorsing your answer from before, it's obviously much easier sorting out a relationship which has failed with regards to God than other human beings. Human beings sometimes find it very, very difficult to forgive. And they might not forgive you no matter how much you want them to. So suppose you did hurt somebody. Then, do you know what you're supposed to do to get them to forgive you? Does anybody know the classical Jewish process? There's some very interesting psychological insights here. And again, Maimonides says the following thing. Suppose you hurt somebody very, very badly. Then what are you supposed to do in order to put it right? So he says, does anybody know? Well, you have to regret it, obviously. But then you have to go and you have to ask the person to forgive you. But before you do even that, there's something else you have to do. And that is, of course, put it right. That means to say, suppose we were all together at a summer camp, and suppose your wallet went missing, and when it was discovered, the money was gone. Right? So you lost a considerable amount of money. Let's say you lost, I don't know, $200. Then it comes to the eve of Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and I come up and I say to you, do you remember the money that was stolen from your wallet? Yes, you say. I have to tell you, I'm so sorry, I'm so ashamed, but it was me. I was really broke. You know, I'm a campus rabbi, and I don't pay very much. And I was really, really desperate. And I saw the money hanging out the jacket and the pound notes or the dollar bills, and I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And because you're a very big person, you say, well, okay, just give me back the money and forget it. I said, oh, I don't actually want to give you back the money. I just want you to forgive me. Right? Well, clearly that doesn't work. If you can remedy the situation, or at least partially remedy the situation, and you let yourself off the hook, then clearly that's not real sorrow, real regret. Real regret is trying to put right as much as you possibly can. So you go to the person and you say, I'm really upset that I did what I did. Not only that, I'm trying my very best to remedy what I did. What if the person says no? What if the person says no? How are you supposed to react if the person says no? Well, you've got to go back and ask them again. And what happens if you ask them again and they still fail to forgive you? They still refuse to forgive you. Then what? Does anybody know? The Rambam says after 3 times, you're done. But more than this. And tell me how you react to this. And the sin that was yours, the crime you committed, now becomes theirs. And now transfers itself across to them. How do you react to that? So something's happened to you, and something hurts you. And the person has asked your forgiveness 3 times. So you've already been hurt by his actions. And if you can't forgive 3 times, then not only have you been hurt, but you are not only the victim, but you're now seen as the perpetrator as well. As though you've done the damage to yourself. Does that sound in any way fair? There are some crimes, there are some experiences that people can go through that are so intense and so appalling that they can't bring themselves to forgive. I remember I used to teach in a girls' seminary, and I discovered there from one of the young ladies I taught the following very, very sad and horrible story. That one of her members of her family was a cousin. She was one of 7, if I remember rightly. Her mother, I assume, must have been a disturbed lady, but she used to lock the kids out on the fire escape all night in their pajamas. We're talking New York, and we're talking during the winter. Any idea how cold it gets in a New York City winter? Seriously cold. Eventually the authorities were were alerted to this, people took appropriate action, and the children were brought up by relatives. When it came to the girl's wedding, the girl was sitting there, and we're talking a Hasidic family, in the room where all the ladies were. She's sitting in a beautiful big chair, wearing her beautiful white dress. And somebody, for the best of motives, I assume, asked her, "Can your mother come and sit beside you?" Now, she had not seen her mother for something like 14 years. So she thought about this and considered this for a second, and she said yes. So the mother, who was at the back of the room, was brought to the front of the room. A chair was placed beside the Kala, beside the bride, and the mother sat there. Nervous smiles were exchanged between the mother and the daughter, and the daughter was able to tolerate her mother's presence for only about 1 minute. And then she started to shake, and she started to get very distressed, and tears started to well up in her eyes, and she started to cry, and then they had to take the mother away. Now, according to what we've just learned, what Maimonides has explained, that if you don't forgive, then the crime becomes yours. Take this example, this true example, and let's place the template of Maimonides of the Rambam on this case. Does that mean to say that the girl is guilty of the crime because she cannot forgive her mother? Does that make any sense? Is that a question?
The mom didn't ask for forgiveness.
Here's an important point. You're right, the mum didn't ask her for forgiveness, that's true. Just as a general tip, some people can't, but they want it. It's very nice and it's very useful if somebody can come up and say, "I'm really sorry." Some people can't bring themselves to say sorry, but they show that they're sorry simply by the change in their behaviour.
It doesn't have to be verbalized.
It should be verbalised. However, I think we can be big enough to understand that some people can't verbalise it and will show it by their behaviour. I think the mother was trying to say that, I think. But let me just put this into context, because this is what Maimonides says in the next halakha, and this is crucial. He says the following thing. Those who are interested, this is in the laws of Teshuvah, and this is the second chapter, and it's the law number 10, Yud. Also, la'odam she'yi achzori. It's forbidden for somebody to be cruel, v'lo yispayas, and not allow themselves to be appeased, not to forgive. A Jewish nature should ideally be one which is very, very hard to provoke to anger and very, very easy to create forgiveness. And at the time when somebody asks for your forgiveness, Michael, with a perfect heart. Problem. But to understand this, you have to look very, very carefully at the words. Now, this is the Rambam, so everything is important here. Every word counts. Oser l'odam she'yi achzori. It's forbidden for a person to be cruel and not allow himself to be appeased. That means to say that if you have offended me and maybe hurt me very deeply, and you come and you sincerely regret it, and you've tried to put it right, and you say, "Please forgive me," and I say, "Get lost." So you come back, which is the halakhic requirement, and say, "Please, I really want you to know I am very, very sorry. In fact, the halakha demands that you've got to bring some of my friends as witnesses to your sincerity." And I say, "Go away." And you come back a third time, and I refuse to forgive you. Then the Rambam says, if the basis of my rejection of your appeal is because I'm being cruel, then the crime becomes mine. Do you get this? But if if I'm saying, "You know what? You want me to forgive you? Burn in hell." Then if I'm expressing my rejection of you through anger and through cruelty, then that's when the crime becomes mine. But if my rejection of your appeal is because I can't forgive you, then of course the crime does not become the person's. The victim does not become the perpetrator. How unfair would that be? So if it's the case that I'm rejecting you out of cruelty, then the crime becomes mine. But if what you're asking forgiveness for is truly unforgivable, then the crime does not become mine. And it's important to know that some people can do to other people some things which are truly unforgivable. That the person simply cannot find it within him or her to be able to forgive. Not that they don't want to, they can't. However, there's a very important principle here. And that is, even if you can't forgive, you should want to. Even if you can't forgive the person, you should want to. Because more than you ever give the person by forgiving them, you give to yourself by forgiving them. Have you got that? I'll say it again. More than you give to the person by forgiving them, you give to yourself. Because you see, unless you can want to forgive them, unless you're moving in that direction, that means that the pain and the offence that happened to you, happened past tense to you, is happening present tense to you, and in all likelihood, future tense to you as well. It's not changing. Nothing is changed. I remember a number of years ago, I was at a conference of university students, and it was in the days when the Union of Jewish Students in this country was a very large and vibrant organisation. They used to have at their winter conference about 300 delegates, which is very large. And there were 6 or 7 young ladies there of shaved hair and Doc Marten appearance, if you follow. And you can probably guess the lifestyle which their dress was expressing. And one young lady and I got into a debate, and indeed an argument, on this lifestyle, which raged for about 4 hours. I seem to remember we came to some sort of crescendo round about 2:30 in the morning. And I think by then I'd established my credentials with her as somebody who was just interested in her as a person who was obviously in pain and obviously was suffering a lot of anger. And it was then at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, in actual fact, she said to me, or she explained to me, revealed to me, that the reason her life had taken the direction that it had was because as a little girl she had been regularly sexually assaulted by her uncle. Although I noticed recently they use the term sexual assault, but I think they mean rape. And I said to her, I honestly can't think of anything worse having happened to a little girl than what happened to you. But you realise, in never being able to move on from that, you're effectively allowing your uncle to rape you every single day of your life. Because if you can't let go of the past, then the past becomes the present. The experience of the past is the experience of the present, and in all probability, the experience of the future as well. More than you're going to be able to give to somebody, which would be quite a gift, to give to somebody by forgiving them, you're giving to yourself. Because when you move away from it, when you let go of the pain, then the pain stops hurting. But no wound will ever heal if it's still open and remains open. For a wound to start healing, it has to start to close. You have to find closure. You have to start letting go. But if you keep picking at it, then obviously it's going to keep bleeding. I was in a BBC TV program a number of years ago. It was called The Heaven and Earth Show. BBC One, audience only about 4 million people. And the subject of the discussion was forgiveness. And there were 2 guests to discuss this topic, myself, and a woman whose sister had been murdered by Rosemary and Fred West. Do you remember that mass murderers, a husband and wife who kidnapped young women, raped them, tortured them and buried them in the cellar of his house. He was a builder, so he excavated shallow graves and covered it in concrete. They found 30 bodies there. And that's only the ones they found in his home. He'd previously been living in Glasgow, and they assumed that that was the address that lots of young women who'd gone missing ended up. This woman's sister was one of the victims. And so, obviously, looking around here, I'm sure everybody can understand that when you lose somebody you love very much, it takes a very long time under ordinary circumstances. If it's just, a parent, an elderly parent who dies of natural causes, it still hurts for a long time. But to have lost somebody who's so young, so tragic, not tragically, tragic is the wrong word, so horrifically, to know that your sister died in such appalling appalling circumstances had devastated this woman. She had sought solace. She had looked for some sort of succor to try and help her in her tremendous struggle. And in the United States of America, apparently there's an annual conference for people who've lost a near relative to murder. And the United States and some of the states with very lax rules when it comes to firearms, etc. Murder is sadly not an insignificant industry. So there is a national conference in the US for people who are the victims of the victims, or the siblings or relations of the victims, to go and talk to each other and hear lectures on the subject. She'd been for 2 years in a row. So there are psychologists, and there are counsellors, and there are religious people, and then there are groups, self-help groups, where they try and do all sorts of comforting discussion. And nothing had helped. But she'd just come back from her third visit. And in this third visit, she'd heard somebody who said the following thing. Somebody had said in a lecture, forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past. Forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past. When I heard those words, I was astonished at the profundity of them. I phoned my very good friend, Rabbi Jonathan Dove. I don't know if Rabbi Dove still lectures here at all. He's moved over from the world of being a rabbi more to the world of being a full-time psychologist. And he's dealing with, almost exclusively, I think, in the Jewish world and in the religious Jewish world. And I, in the conversation with him, managed to tell him this story. And he phoned me back a week later. And he said, YY, I want you to know that I have had 6 clients with whom I had no success whatsoever over the last year. There was no progress. Until I told them your magic words, which incidentally, let me remind you, were not mine, it was this lady's. And that was, forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past. When they heard this, they started to move. They started to make progress. It's just the point I made before. Forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past, because if you can't remove yourself from the past, then you're living the past. Forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past. Some people are fighting the battles of the past and the great injustices, and don't get me wrong, we're talking here real injustice, horrific things, the unforgivable. But you can't change the past. The past happened. You can change the effects of the past. What the past is doing to you, that you can change. But the circumstances, that you can't change. Forgiveness means giving up the hope of a better past. And if you can give up the hope of a better past, then you can start to move forward. And this woman had started to heal. And these 6 people had started to heal. You've got to let go of the pain. It doesn't matter that you can't forgive. It matters that you don't want to forgive. But again, let me repeat. More than you ever give the person, you gain for yourself by forgiving. The anchor is up. You're no longer stuck. You can start to sail away. Now, it might be the progress is very small. It might be that it's very long. But you're starting to move away from the pain. Now, at this point, let me just quickly make an important interjection here. What if the person doesn't want forgiveness? What if the person doesn't want to be forgiven? I'm talking here now. Have you got the category of offence that I'm talking about? I am not talking about somebody stole your money, your $300 a year, £500 or whatever it was. That you can forgive. We can all forgive that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's a lot of money. It might have been very significant to you at the time. But you can get over that. I'm talking the category of offence, the category of crime that was visited on you, which is so intense, so appalling, that you're going to need professional help to try and recover from it. To give you a simple indicator, I'm talking about the sort of crime or the sort of offence that you're going to need professional help to go over, and you would never want anybody to know occurred to you. Like the cases I've mentioned before. Somebody stole your money, there's no difficulty in you letting people know that you lost the money. There's no shame, there's no embarrassment. It's not devastating. In fact, the danger would be that you would want to tell everybody who stole your money. I'm talking the sort of case where you don't want anybody to know it happened to you, that you're going to need professional help from. And if it is the case that you start to heal yourself, you start to cure yourself by letting go, then you should simply know that sometimes, I'm talking big things here. I know this just might sound a little bit trite. It might sound, how can he say that? Does he really know? But it never is the case that you have to make these sort of battles, fight these sorts of battles, make these sorts of journeys alone. That would be an enormous mistake. The bigger the battle, the more allies you need. And some mountains are just too big to climb alone. You need a whole support team. You're going to need the equipment, the appropriate equipment to make that journey, to climb that hill. Try and do it on your own. Of course you're going to fail. It's essential that a person gets the support to be able to do this. And even if you can't see a way to forgive the unforgivable, there may be a way. And maybe you've tried. Maybe you know this idea. Maybe you know that if you let go of the past, you would start being cured. Life would get you. And maybe you've tried before and it hasn't worked. Well, it might simply be because you've tried it in the wrong way. Suppose you go to your doctor because you've got, headaches, stomach aches, and sore bones. And he says, okay, I'll give you these blue tablets and that'll cure you. A week of these, one in the morning, one in the evening, will be fine. But after a week, you're just as bad as you were before. So you go back to see the doctor and he says, okay, I'll give you another course of the blue tablets. So you take one in the morning, one in the evening, and after a week, you're still the same. So you go back and he gives you another course. If you go back a fourth time and he offers you the blue tablets, what should you do? Get a new doctor. This guy's garbage, right? You want somebody who'll give you the pink tablets. These tablets don't work. And if it's been the case that you've been approaching it in a certain way and not seen success, doesn't mean to say that there isn't success. It just might mean that you've been going about it the wrong way. And of course you might be going about it the wrong way. You're the victim. You're in tremendous pain. The unforgivable, the sort of crime that is so bad you're going to need proper psychological intervention to recover from, that's so embarrassing you don't want anybody to know about it. Well, surprise, surprise, you've not been able to get out of it. For goodness sake, you could be drowning since it happened. It would hardly be surprising that you've not thought of a good strategy to find yourself back on the path to a healthy and whole living. So that's when you're going to need support. You're going to need somebody who can help you. It's never a failure when you fight any war that you got an ally, that you got somebody there who said, you know what, try it this way. And if you're a woman, then it might be that you need a woman to help you. And if you're a man, you might need a man to help you. You need somebody who understands and knows your situation, and somebody who's got a good reputation in being able to deal with the problems that you're struggling with. Never struggle alone. That's an enormous mistake. But we have within us, all of us, resources which we're sometimes totally unaware of, which can allow us to overcome some of the most appalling crimes and appalling circumstances which we would normally think would demolish us. I once saw in a magazine article, when the State of Israel had recently been created, there was a woman, I think we're talking 1952, who went to see a doctor in Jerusalem. I don't know what her problem was, but the doctor was looking at her and dealing with her, and he noticed that she was wearing a very, very unusual bracelet. It was gold, and it seemed to have ivory. So pieces of ivory mounted in gold. So he commented on how unusual and indeed how beautiful this was, and received the answer that, yes, in whatever town she came from, whatever it was in the old country, Romania, Hungary, wherever, it was the custom that every baby that was born, when the baby grew up, and the first milk tooth, the first baby tooth that fell out, they took this and they mounted it in gold. And it became a link in this bracelet. So these were her children's first tooth that fell out. Okay? And so she said that this is David, and this was Sarah, and this was Rivka, and this was Daniel. And we threw all the names. I think there were 9 altogether. And every single one of her children had been killed in Auschwitz. So the doctor said, please forgive me asking, but how come you can bear to wear it? She said, in some surprise, I'm now the matron in an orphanage. She's the matron in an orphanage. She's now the mother to children who don't have parents anymore. She, the mother who doesn't have children anymore, became the mother to children who don't have parents anymore. It's astonishing. People can sometimes find within themselves, and it might be lying there, resources and techniques and strengths to overcome the most appalling things that have happened. And that's what Jews have done, have we not? Consider this. Looking around the room here, this is going to sound as though I'm being very, very impertinent, but I'm not trying to be. Why is anybody here normal? Why are you normal? Have you considered this? I mean, did you know that Jews have a higher incidence in the UK, I suppose worldwide, but certainly in the UK, have a higher incidence of mental illness than any other group? Did you know this? Yes. Which is hardly surprising. I don't find that at all surprising. First of all, the reason we've got all these genetic diseases like Tay-Sachs is because we were kept in ghettos and we weren't allowed to get out, and therefore, of course, if somebody built a wall around this room just now, that means that as marriage partners we would all have to choose each other, and that means to say the next generation, our kids would marry the people in this ghetto, in this room, and give it a couple of generations, everybody's related to everybody, and of course, the more close the gene pool and the narrower it is, then you get all sorts of problems occurring. I suppose that impacts equally when it comes to psychological disorders. So, let's consider for a second this situation here. Oh, if we combine that, incidentally, with the fact that almost every single Jew, do you know your family history? Have you looked at your family history? Why are you here? Why did you end up in the UK? Almost every single Jew is a refugee, or your grandparent, or your great-grandparent, your great-grandparent. You fled pogrom, you fled the Nazis, go all the way through history, you fled the Spanish Inquisition. I was once dealing at Manchester University with a young lady who was a sweet, gorgeous, clever young lady, and in the last year of her degree she had a breakdown. So she went back to London, where she came from. When she came back to finish her degree, which she did successfully, her fiancé told me the following story. Her father took her to see a psychiatrist. They sat down in front of the psychiatrist, and the father started to explain his daughter's situation. I was in Auschwitz, he said. I was pulled from a pile of corpses. I shouldn't be here. I should be dead. And if I should be dead, that means she shouldn't be here either, pointing to his daughter. And if she's here, she has to do as well as she possibly can. She's got to stop this nonsense, breakdowns and nonsense like that. I mean, I should be dead, and she... And on and on and on it went. The psychiatrist, who was wise, smiled and said, Mr. Cohen, if you could wait outside, I'd like to talk to your daughter. And so Mr. Cohen waited outside, and he turned around and said, you don't need me. He needs me. And of course that was true. But I have a picture in my mind of a perfectly well-balanced Jewish father who walks around the corner in 1808 in Warsaw and bumps into a group of Napoleon Bonaparte's anti-Semitic soldiers who grab him and beat him up. This produces in him neurosis, paranoia, which he passes on to his kids, to his kids, to his kids, to his kids. And I'm dealing with it at university in the UK all these generations later. So why is any Jew normal? Have you ever considered this question? And yet we are. And yet Jews have survived Holocaust and pogrom and all of these things because within us, that's us as a people, but you as individuals, even me as an individual, sometimes there are resources there that can get us through the worst times. And that which seems to be unforgivable can become forgivable. And if you can't see a way to make it forgivable yourself, it doesn't mean to say there isn't a way for you to forgive them, for you. To start you healing. And if you can't see a way yourself, it doesn't mean to say there isn't a way. All you have to do is to find somebody who might be able to turn around and say, you've been taking the blue tablets. Have you thought of the pink tablets? Let's try it in this direction. You know, I was in Switzerland on that trip, which I told you about with my large knife, which incidentally, I never got back. But when I arrived at the hotel in Arosa, I was there, as I said, with another couple who were friends of my wife and myself. We were sitting there on Friday night singing Zmiras. He's got a very, very nice singing voice and takes music very seriously. I've been blessed with a nice singing voice too. We often harmonize. There was another family sitting at the table behind us. And there was about 6, 7 kids, a couple of them about my own age, and there was a Jewish grandmother, a Yiddish Boba. And when we started to sing, she turned around. And she was looking like this. I didn't see her, of course, she was behind me. My wife said, you should have seen that old lady. She was really listening. After the next course, we started to sing again. This time she took her chair and she turned around and she came and sat beside us. And we were introduced to her because our friend, she knows her very well. And I'm very, very thrilled to tell you that it turned out that this old lady is a relation of mine. Relations through marriage. You know the old joke that if 2 Jews meet each other and after 5 minutes they find that they're not related? It just means they haven't been talking long enough. And so she was originally a Feingold. And my daughter-in-law's mother was a Feingold. Grandmother was a Feingold. One of my daughter-in-laws. And this young lady, she wrote a book. It's called The Living Miracle. I would recommend it warmly to you. The Living Miracle, published by Targum, my publisher. And in it, when I read the story, amazed. She was in 3 concentration camps. And it's very frank, much franker than a religious Jewish publishing house normally lets their books be. And she talks about how after the war, after the starvation in 3 concentration camps, the normal monthly birth cycles had ceased in her body. They told her she would never have any children. She went on to 14 children. She and her husband became key educators in Switzerland, helping many, many survivors of the concentration camps. And when she told me the story herself, she said, that was my answer to Hitler. 14 children. She, who they said would never have any children, 14. Take that, Hitler. I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could be that brave. But we, as a people, and in all probability you as an individual, can sometimes find strength within yourself to overcome even the worst things, the most appalling things, the unforgivable. And when you do, you start to heal. And when you start to heal, you start to get your life back. You start to move forward. And if you can't find a way to do it yourself, find someone. It's never a failure if you get help. Because it was your victory in finding somebody in the first place. Find somebody good, and ask them to help you. If you're a man, it might be a man. A woman might be a woman. And start to move forward. And sometimes you can find yourself forgiving the unforgivable. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to do them. Hi.
So another example would be if a Jew that was in the concentration camps and everything, he met, say, one of the Jewish policemen after the war.
Yeah.
And he knows as a direct result of what that Jewish policeman did, his family perished in the Holocaust. And he can't bring himself to forgive, but he kind of like has almost cut that part of the battle of him off. So he's almost healing and he's rebuilding his life.
Yeah.
Does that mean that he's like high all the mistakes that this Jewish policeman did because he can't forgive him?
No, I don't think so. That's a very interesting example. Is that one you just conjured up, or do you actually know a case like that?
I just made that up.
Well, very impressive. Look, you probably know that Holocaust survivors themselves, there is a horrible postscript to their life, a horrible postscript to their experience, which is as they get older and reach the final chapters of their life, then what happened to them, instead of fading further into the past, comes back with a fury, comes back with a clarity which haunts them. And I certainly know in Gateshead, there was a Jew there, my Rav, the Gateshead Rav, told me there was a certain Jew there who, he passed away now, but toward the last 5 years of his life were hell. Because instead of being, something he'd forgotten, it was as though it happened yesterday. So it's interesting to think about this for just a second, whether or not, your example here, the fellow has, as we're closed it out of his mind. In forgiving the fellow, he's got to open it all up again. But we're talking a hypothetical case, but I would have to worry that it's going to be opened up again anyway. It seems to be that that's the psychology of the survivor of the Holocaust. At the end, it comes back. So therefore, if he would have been able to deal with it and cure it, then at an earlier stage, then that might have helped him when it comes back at a later stage. Does that make sense? Yeah.
From a non-psychological sense, in terms of like the halakha, does he have to, if he doesn't forgive him?
No, again, remember that I want to re-emphasize that to you. Remember the Rambam, when he says that the sin becomes yours if you don't forgive, it's only and uniquely if the lack of forgiveness is out of cruelty. You're not forgiving because of cruelty. But if you're not forgiving because you can't forgive, then certainly the crime doesn't become yours. What I'm saying though, however, in wanting to be able to forgive, to be able to turn and say, what you did, my children is dead because of you, because you worked for the Nazis or whatever, I can't forgive you. I'd like to be able to, but I can't. But I'd like to be able to is important for you. Because you're no longer the bad guy. Right? He's the bad guy. You just can't. That girl could not forgive her mother. Right? Nothing wrong with the girl. It's just the pain, as I said, some things that can be done which are too intense and too deep to be ever cured. And you have to deal with it. Again, it's important to know that you can do things that somebody, even if they wanted to, could never forgive you. That polices our behaviour to some degree. But is this person to be blamed because they couldn't forgive? No. Incidentally, on that point, remember we did say the person has to ask for forgiveness. So you didn't put that in your little example. Suppose the guy's on his knees and he really forget. What has he done to try and forgive them? I have a friend of mine who used to produce me at the BBC when I was very busy at the BBC in those days. And in fact, just wrote to him today, a very good friend of mine called John Forrest, non-Jewish fellow, Christian. And he says that it's a question that often comes up. I don't know, has anybody ever asked you this question? Could you forgive the Nazis? He says it's an anti-Semitic question. The very posing of the question to a Jew is an anti-Semitic question. I suppose in as much as, how could you expect Jews to forgive? And anyway, here's an important point. I can forgive you for what you did to me, perhaps, depending on what it is. I can't forgive you for what you did to him. If you come up and punch him in the nose and then come up and say, will you forgive me? It's not my nose, which is now 23 degrees west of where it used to be. Right? It's his ex-nose we're discussing in this case. Then it's very difficult, as I can't forgive you for other people. And of course, once a life is taken and the person's no longer there, it's very difficult to get them to forgive you as well. Although there's an idea of going to somebody's grave and asking for forgiveness as well. But the crucial point in this one is the Nazis aren't asking for forgiveness. Nazis are not saying, please forgive us for what we did. They're celebrating what they did. They're even denying what they did in the hope of being able to do it again. Not because they don't think it happened. Of course they know it happened. I once saw a piece of anti-Semitic graffiti here in London on the wall. It said, again the lie of 6 million, tomorrow the promise of 12. Listen to the corruption and the insanity of the Nazi mind. Again the lie of 6 million, tomorrow the promise of 12. So hold on, is that a lie? Is that a promise? Something you're hoping to happen? Something you're hoping did happen? So again, what's missing in this case, of course, and in your case you also missed it out, is the guy actually saying sorry. But assuming the guy did say sorry and tried to put it right, and it's a Jew, you should, if you can say, I'd like to be able to forgive you. Forget him. I'm talking about you. You might be helping yourself. You might be helping yourself. Yes?
How does one develop an ability to forgive oneself for an avera that you did against God?
You're going to have to come back to my lectures tomorrow night. We're actually doing that as a whole lecture. There's a whole lecture on the subject, yeah. It's called Learning to Love Yourself. Learning to love others, learning to love yourself. And that's where it starts. You mustn't be too tough on yourself. If you can't forgive yourself, you certainly are going to find it very difficult to forgive others as well. If you apply standards to yourself, which are very, very strict, then in all probability you'll apply the same standards to other people too. I wrote in my first book, Dancing Through Time, about an experience I had in South Africa. I remember I was doing a Shabbaton, and there was a guy there who seemed to like me. He was an Israeli, I think he was about 36. And after Shabbat, it was in a hotel, and there was a pub in the hotel. And England were playing Germany on TV, and they offered to buy me a beer. So I said, okay, let's go in and get a Kessel Ale, because that's what they drink in South Africa. Kessel Ale, Kessel, yeah? Yeah, I got it right? Good. And so we're standing around the bar, and of course, being a Scotsman, and a Scottish Jew, my loyalties or my support for which team was really tested to the limit here. I mean, obviously, as a Jew, you don't want the Germans necessarily to win, but as Scotsman, you certainly don't want England to win. I won't tell you who I was supporting. And it turned out that all three of these guys, all Israelis, had been in Israel's 3 wars. This guy, my guy, the younger guy, he said he was in the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War. He said if you ask these guys, they'll tell you that the Lebanon War was a piece of cake compared to their wars. One was in the 67 war, one was in the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. He said, but that wasn't my experience. And he explained the following incredibly interesting story. To me, it was very, very moving. You see, he came from an extremely religious background. B'nai Brak, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. And what happened was that he was the son, the children, him and his siblings, the children of somebody who was a Holocaust survivor. I think he was a Holocaust survivor, or the son of a Holocaust survivor. Whatever the truth was, the regime which his parents implanted or imposed on the kids was incredibly strict. And he rebelled. The rabbi, he was actually taken by his father to a rabbi because he told me one Friday night he was sitting like this, holding onto the table with his hands to stop him hitting his father. And the father was provoking him. The rabbi said, if your son hits you, it's your fault. So clearly the objective opinion was the father was clearly to blame. And of course in Israel in those days, from a Haredi background, there's a very nice way to cement and to publicize your rebellion against your parents, which is to do what? Join the army. Right, run away and join the army, which is what he did. Bad timing. Just after his training, Lebanon War. And so off he went there. His job was to set up field hospitals. Right? That's what he was trained to do. And he became very, very good at this, and he became promoted. Eventually he was in charge of field hospitals. He said his first, they say it was an easy war. He was driving toward a field hospital once, and there lying by the side of the road was a boot with a leg in it. And he would say where the helicopter pad should be, and it was his job to assess, of course, the medical guidance, who should be evacuated back to Tel Aviv, to the hospitals first. That was that. And then one day he said that he was transferred to another hospital, and he walked into a ward, and there was his sister. His sister was a nurse. And they just rushed towards each other, folded each other in a hug, and cried for about 10 minutes in each other's arms. And he said, tell Mum and Dad, I forgive them. They tried their best. Then he started to be cured. It was the exact same process. Now his father's behaviour, from all accounts, his and the objective voice of the rabbis, must have been appalling. I'll say about myself, and I say it often, another talk in bringing up kids, if you ask my kids, did I and my late wife, Shalom, make a mess of bringing them up as kids, and they say yes, I'm afraid I'll have to accept their verdict. After all, they were my victims. However, if you ask my kids, did your mum and dad try to be good parents? And they say, no, I can't accept that. I know we tried. We try and we fail. Right? There are very few perfect parents out there. Okay? Anybody here already a parent? Anybody got ambitions to be a perfect parent? Forget it. You ain't. I'm sure you'll be brilliant, but you won't be perfect. We all make mistakes. And as a consequence of that, this father, now they were obviously, maybe he was a Holocaust survivor, it's hardly a surprise. But the son said, tell them I forgive them. He realized they did the best and they were not very good. Given their circumstances, they weren't very good. But when he said, I forgive you, he started to.
Has one forgive oneself that you done the Vera, and it's kind of, there in the back.
Something, now you're talking between you and God.
Yeah.
God gets such a bum rap. I remember as a girl, I used to teach in a girls' seminary, and there was a girl who came up to me, now we're talking, very religious girl. She came to see me, and she was in tears. She was French, and she sat down, and she started to cry. And I said, what's wrong? She said, she's got stomach cancer. I said, quoi? She said, stomach cancer. I said, qu'est-ce que tu dis? What are you talking about? Stomach cancer. And I was appalled. If you know anything about cancers, that's really one you don't really want to get. And and then the story wasn't adding up. Why is she in the seminary with stomach cancer? I said, have you been to a doctor? No. How do you know you've got stomach cancer? She's got pains in her stomach. Well, wake up and smell the coffee. Lots of people get pains in the stomach. I get pains in my stomach. What makes you think that it is stomach cancer? So she told me the following story. Her father was a Rosh Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Big time frum. Are you with me? And a few weeks before, at the vacation at the Bein Hazmanim, at the break in the seminary year, she'd been back home and she was standing at a bus stop. And there was a boy at the bus stop. He spoke to her. She replied. That was it. Stomach cancer. I mean, it goes without saying, doesn't it? Right? Now, let me just put this in context. In her background, in her world, indeed, she shouldn't have spoken to this boy. She shouldn't have replied to him. He shouldn't have spoken to her. She shouldn't have spoken to him. That's not the way it's done in their world. I'll even tell you, in my world. However, to think that God's going to smite you with stomach cancer because you spoke to a boy, that's just a little bit bonkers. Okay? God ain't that cruel. Okay? He allows you to make mistakes. He allows you to make lots of mistakes. You do make lots of mistakes. And if you don't realize that you make lots of mistakes, then, and if you're holding out for perfection, then indeed, you're in trouble. You're expected to make mistakes. And indeed, if you made a mistake, learn from it. And make sure you don't do it again. Grow from it. But to say that God will say, you made that mistake, that's it, you're finished, no. Don't be so tough on yourself, and certainly don't be so tough on God. If he forgives you for murder and adultery, as we saw before, then he can forgive me for the occasional slip-up that I make as well, like robbing banks and things like that. Thank you very much indeed.